Today, installment of the Reformulation seminar, Reformulating the Food Environment, and today we'll be looking at sodium. Now, I'm Suzanne Soares-Winter, the clinical nutritionist at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research, and I'll be your chair for today. On behalf of the Global Health Advocacy Project, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our participants, those of you who may have joined from the beginning, and those of you who may be new and joining us for the first time today. This is a series of seminars that is being sponsored by the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the Caribbean Institute for Health Research, Caribbean Public Health Agency, the National Food Industry Task Force, the Scientific Research Council, and the University of Technology. And so you may know that the seminar series that we've designed is really there to inform manufacturers and various other stakeholders like yourself and other participants just about the importance of reformulating the foods and beverages that we have in our food landscape. You know, how we as a country in Jamaica can adjust the composition of our products in such a way that they're healthier and more nutritious, and more importantly, to reduce any harmful effects from the foods and beverages that we are eating. I'm going to share my slides so you can follow me more closely. So as I said, today we'll be focusing mainly on sodium. Last week we focused on sugars. And so each series, we will be focusing on a different aspect of nutrients that are of concern to us in the region. Just basic information, we know that reformulation really is about altering the food or beverage product, the recipe or composition in a way that it will improve the product's health profile. Since we're focusing on sodium, one important point is just to recognize that sodium is actually present in nearly all foods to some extent, but it is widely used in food manufacturing for different purposes. And therefore, it can present a hidden danger because oftentimes it's not something we can necessarily taste or recognize in foods. Now, why is it that we're focusing on sodium as one of the nutrients of a concern? Currently, at least 91% of the prepackaged foods that we have here in Jamaica are considered processed. Processed in that they do have some amount of nutrients, excess nutrients in them. 46% of them are actually high in sodium in that they have excessive amounts that may be harmful to health. And so it's in reformulating, we have to somehow balance the taste versus the preservation aspects versus the health aspects. And so just to know that the main goal of this seminar series today is really to highlight some of those important qualities of sodium, the health aspects, and how we can perhaps adjust the food manufacturing process. So why should we reduce sodium and salt? We are going to ask Professor Ferguson to introduce why it is that we are reducing sodium or salt content in foods. Our next speaker will be Ms. Prudence Hall, who will speak on the functions of salt in products and factors affecting consumer acceptance. Following that, we will look at the practical recommendations for reducing or replacing salt or sodium, and that will be done by Ms. Avalon Gilpin. followed by Ms. Philippa O'Connor, who will speak on opportunities for nutrition claims and labeling and give us an idea of what currently exists here in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. And in between, because we want to make sure that everybody's pretty much stays alert during our seminar series, although the information is quite exciting, we will have a health break by the Ministry of Health just to get us moving a bit. And that will be somewhere in between. And we'll also have the opportunity for you to place questions in the chat. So if you look at the bottom of your screen in the chat component, we ask you to please place any questions or comments that you may have in that section. So intermittently throughout the presentations, we will break for you to have those interventions. Before we go on, I just want to remind you that next week you should come back because we will be speaking on trans fats. That's next week, Wednesday, July 7th, at the same time, 10 o'clock. And we will be focusing on trans fats, and we have quite an array of speakers lined up for that. So please make sure you come back for that, but we'll remind you again later on at the end of this seminar. Also, what I would like you to do so that we can get an idea of who everyone is here on the call, what we'd like for you to do is please let us know in the chat section who you are and the organization that you belong in. And so we can get to an idea of who everyone is and perhaps, invite others to come in our later discussions. All right. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, the need for salt reduction in foods and the sodium content of foods, which will be given by Professor Trevor Ferguson. He's a professor of epidemiology and internal medicine, and he's current director at the Epidemiology Research Unit, or ERU, at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research Care at the University of the West Indies. He's an honorary consultant in general internal medicine at the University Hospital of the West Indies. Dr. Ferguson went to medical school at UWI and later completed specialist training, leading to a Doctor of Medicine degree in internal medicine. He has a Master of Science degree in epidemiology from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine through the University of London External Program. He also has a Doctor of Philosophy degree in epidemiology at the UWI. He's a fellow of the American College of Physicians and the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and he was recently appointed a Bernard Loan Scholar in Cardiovascular Health at the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ferguson's research focuses on cardiovascular disease epidemiology and diabetes, and he has a particular interest in the etiology of hypertension and risk factors for cardiovascular disease. He's presented to regional and international audience and contributed to authorship of over 80 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals. Dr. Ferguson, over to you. And thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and good morning, everyone. Let me just share my presentation. All right, just confirming that you're able to see the slides and they're in their proper order.
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So good morning again, everyone, and thanks to the Heart Foundation and the other partners for inviting me to make this presentation. As introduced, we'll be talking about salt and its importance in health, and particularly why should we reduce the sodium content in foods. So most of us are very familiar with salts, which the chemical name is sodium chloride, and it is a major component of the food supply in almost every country. It is commonly used to flavor food and as a binder and stabilizer, and also often used as a food preservative. Now, humans require a small amount of sodium for normal physiological functioning. However, in terms of, just to give additional details, sodium is the main cation in extracellular fluid and is also important in the regulation of extracellular fluid volume as well as plasma volume. And sodium is important in the conduction of nerve impulses and the muscles. So clearly sodium is important. However, we need only about 500 milligrams of sodium daily in order to carry out these functions. In the diet, the main sources of sodium comes from table salt, which, as we mentioned before, is sodium chloride, but other sources such as monosodium glutamate and sodium bicarbonate are fairly common, and other forms of sodium salts used as preservatives. Most people consume between 9 to 12 grams of salt per day, which translates to about 3,500 to 4,700 milligrams of sodium. And this is 1.5 to 2 times the recommended maximum level of salt intake. So basically in every country, or in almost every country, salt intake is much higher than that which is needed and definitely higher than that which is recommended. Now, in terms of the sources of salt, so in developed countries, most sodium comes from processed foods, and Dr. Suarez Winter mentioned the importance of processed foods in the overall food chain, and also for foods prepared outside the home. Now, in addition, particularly in developing countries, salt added during cooking may also be an important source of sodium. With regards to global sodium consumption, in 2010, it was estimated that the mean global sodium intake was 3.95 grams per day, which was approximately 10% higher in men compared to women, and intakes were highest in East Asia and Central Asia, as well as in Europe. And intakes were lowest, as we can see in the green and blue colored countries, in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in Latin America. Now, with regards to the Caribbean, we have estimates from Barbados from their Health of the Nation study, where they found that mean sodium excretion was 2.6 grams per day. Again, this was higher in men as well as in younger persons. And when they looked at the percentage that exceeded the 2 grams per day as recommended by the World Health Organization, they found that 6 to 7% of the population exceeded the recommended intakes. While sodium intake was excessive, mean potassium excretion was only 1.5 grams per day, and less than 0.5% met the recommended minimum potassium intake. With regards to the Jamaican situation, we do not have a lot of published data. In one of the studies published in 2005 from the SORT trial, baseline sodium excretion was estimated at 3.4 grams per day. However, this was in a small sample of about 56 participants. We expect to complete analyses of data from the Jamaica Health and Lifestyle Survey 3 in the next few months, and that should provide some more recent data on sodium consumption within the Jamaican context. Now, with regards to sodium and its effect on health, this slide summarizes the various ways in which sodium affects health and the adverse outcomes related to excessive dietary sodium. So here we can see that sodium affects a number of physiological mechanisms. So increased dietary sodium results in raised blood pressure, also causes blood vessel damage. There are influences on hormonal pathways, inflammatory pathways, as well as the immune response, and it also affects the gut microbiome. In addition, there's damage to the gastric mucosa, increased urinary calcium excretion, alteration of body fat metabolism, and increased fluid and often soft drink consumption. What this translates to is that there's a higher rate of ischemic heart disease, higher rate of hypertensive heart disease, as well as higher rates of heart failure. In addition, there is increased risk of stroke, as well as increased risk of dementia. There's increased prevalence of chronic kidney disease, increased risk of stomach cancer. Excessive dietary sodium is also associated with osteoporosis and renal stones. And because of the increased consumption and changes in body fat deposition, also may be associated with obesity. When all of this is put together, the Global Burden of Disease study estimates that approximately $7 million are attributable to increased sodium intake, and that increased sodium intake was responsible for approximately 3 million deaths each year. So clearly this is a major public health concern and something that we should look at to see how we can change this problem of excess dietary sodium. Just a little bit of additional information on the effect of sodium and blood pressure. So in general, it has been found that populations with higher sodium intake have higher blood pressure. Dietary sodium reduction has been shown to lower blood pressure in both non-hypertensive as well as in hypertensive individuals. And over 100 clinical trials have examined the relationship between sodium intake and blood pressure. Overall, the evidence strongly indicates a direct relationship between sodium intake and elevated blood pressure. Now, one of the major studies contributing to this data was the InterSalt study. And in this study, the investigators measured 24-hour sodium excretion among over 10,000 individuals from 32 countries. They found that sodium excretion ranged from 0.2 millimoles per day among the Yanomamo people in Brazil to over 242 millimoles per day in northern China. And just to make the numbers a little bit more practical, this really ranged from about 5 milligrams of sodium per day to over 5,500 milligrams of sodium per day. Now, populations with higher sodium consumption had higher average blood pressure and greater increase of blood pressure with age. And when they looked at the data, they were able to show that the effect was seen both within center, so that this is an individual level effect, as well as across center or a group level effect. And this slide illustrates some of the findings from the InterSalt study, essentially showing that as mean sodium intake or sodium excretion increased, blood pressure increased, and this association was statistically significant. Another important study which demonstrated that reducing sodium consumption reduces blood pressure was the DASH sodium trial. And most of us are familiar with the DASH diet, which essentially is a diet consisting of high levels of fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy products, lean portions of poultry and fish, as well as high-fiber varieties of carbohydrates. And this diet by itself has been shown to lower blood pressure. However, when you add sodium reduction to the DASH diet, there's further reduction in blood pressure. And in this illustration, we see that the low sodium DASH diet was associated with a significantly lower systolic blood pressure, ranging from between 5 millimeters of mercury to 21 millimeters of mercury. And the level of decrease in blood pressure varied according to the baseline blood pressure. And similar patterns were seen with diastolic blood pressure. Of course, the magnitude of the effect was lower. Also important is a demonstration in longitudinal studies that lower sodium consumption was associated with reduced cardiovascular disease. So this slide illustrates some data from the trials of hypertension prevention. And in this study, they looked at sodium levels from 24-hour urine collections collected over 1.5 to 4 years, and followed up patients over 2,200 participants at 10 to 15 years. And they were able to show that there was a 17% increase in cardiovascular risk for every 1 gram increase in daily sodium intake. Further follow-up at 20 years demonstrated a 12% increase in all-cause mortality for every 1 gram of increase in sodium intake. So essentially, what we have demonstrated is first is that most populations are consuming much higher sodium levels than recommended. We have found that increased sodium consumption is associated with increased blood pressure, that reducing sodium consumption reduces blood pressure, and that higher levels of sodium consumption is associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So that provides very good justification for us to want to reduce sodium in the diet. So what are some of the approaches that can be used? Broadly speaking, we can speak of individual level changes as well as population level approaches to sodium reduction. With the individual level approach, this focuses on a low salt diet. And here we have individual level education. We teach persons to read labels, to avoid high salt foods, to limit consumption of processed foods, limit the use of salt in cooking, and not to add salt at the table. The challenge here is that because salt is so ubiquitous, this can be very difficult, because unless we go to a completely, quote unquote, natural diet with no processed foods, we are likely to have higher levels of salt than recommended. So what is needed is more of a population-based approach. And with the population-based approach, we're looking at population-wide education, reduced salt content in processed foods, and reduced use of salt in food establishments. This approach is more far-reaching. As we have pointed out before, most salt in the diet comes from processed foods and foods prepared from outside the home. So if this is not addressed, then we're not going to have the level of sodium reduction that is required. And additionally, we do have several examples of successful population-wide approaches to reduction in sodium. And this slide demonstrates some of the countries in which this has been done with success, including Finland, Portugal, Japan, and the United Kingdom. And we'll say a little bit about the United Kingdom's approach. So in the UK, they were able to develop and successfully implement a program of voluntary sodium reduction in collaboration with the food industry in the early 2000s. Now, they were able to reduce population salt intake by 15%, from 9.5 grams daily in 2003 to 8.1 grams daily in 2011. There was a corresponding reduction in systolic blood pressure of 2.7 millimeters of mercury after adjusting for potential confounders. They were able to demonstrate that stroke and ischemic heart disease mortality were reduced by 36% over the same period, and estimated that 30% of the stroke reduction and 20% of the ischemic heart disease reduction was attributable to this reduction in sodium intake. And this slide just illustrates the findings. So here we see between 2003 and 2011, mean population sodium intake was significantly reduced. Similarly, there was reduction in systolic blood pressure over the period, as well as reductions in diastolic blood pressure. And correspondingly, there is a reduction in the rate of ischemic heart disease, as well as in the rate of stroke. So overall, we see that consistent pattern: reduced salt consumption, reduce systolic blood pressure, reduce cardiovascular disease mortality. And this is the pattern that we hope to replicate in many other countries. So the World Health Organization has put together a package to help member states achieve this sodium reduction at the population level. And this is called the SHAKE package. And the overall recommendation is to get sodium intake to less than 5 grams of salt, that is per day, or 2,000 milligrams of sodium, or a target of a 30% relative reduction in mean population intake by 2025. What are the measures recommended? In the SHAKE package, there are 5 components. First, the surveillance, which requires measuring and monitoring salt use. Secondly, harnessing industry to promote reformulation of foods and meals to contain less salt. And of course, this is one of the main focus of the webinar today. Thirdly, looking at adopting standards for labeling and marketing. So we want to implement standards for effective and accurate labeling and marketing of foods. And of course, there are active programs or strategies to try to get this done within the local context. Also, to educate, increasing knowledge where we educate and communicate to empower individuals to eat less salt. And finally, to create a supportive environment where it is convenient for persons to have healthy eating, whether in schools, the workplace, hospitals, home, or in other settings. So finally, I just want to make a very quick statement on the relevance of food labels and salt consumption. And this slide just illustrates findings for a very quick literature review, so to speak. And I'm highlighting findings from 3 papers that demonstrate that there's clear benefit for appropriate food labels in reducing salt consumption. So in this first paper, study looked at the use of nutrition labels and how this influenced sodium intake in the United States. And they concluded that frequent use of nutrition labels appears to be associated with lower consumption of sodium and high sodium foods in the United States. Another study, a systematic review, found that using food labels was associated with healthier diets and should continue to be promoted through policies and education programs. And in the last study being mentioned here, a meta-analysis which found that food labeling reduces consumer dietary intake of selected nutrients and influences industrial practices to reduce product contents of sodium and artificial trans fat. So overall, the evidence suggests that appropriate labeling does help in reducing the consumption of harmful nutrients, and therefore is a strategy that should be promoted as part of our public health response. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Ferguson. I'm always surprised at how much, this very simple nutrient like sodium can have so many risk factors. And it really just requires very small changes for major improvements. But thank you very much. That was very interesting. Okay, well, we'll move on to our next speaker. We'll hear from Ms. Prudence Hall about the functions of sodium in products and factors affecting consumer acceptance. Because we know that sodium, it really provides a lot in terms of just how foods, the flavor and the texture, and I'm sure that much more will be shared by Ms. Hall. But first, let me give you some background on who she is. Ms. Prudence Hall is a biomedical scientist, also at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research. She holds an undergraduate degree in biotechnology and chemistry from the University of the West Indies, a postgraduate diploma in food science and technology from the University of East London. She's a certified food technologist and cosmetic chemist, and she's currently pursuing postgraduate work in biomedical research with focus on body composition, metabolism, and cardiovascular issues in a pediatric population. Her research interests currently include body composition and health, CVD epidemiology, nutrition policy, child health, and obesity. She's a certified peer reviewer by Publons Academy and is a director at the Lions Club of Downtown Kingston. And so, Ms. Hall, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Suarez-Winter. Good morning, everybody. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so as Dr. Suarez-Winter mentioned, this morning I'll be speaking about the functions of salt in food and the factors affecting consumer acceptance of food. In my presentation, I will cover what exactly is sodium or salt, the functions of salt or sodium in products, the sodium levels in prepackaged foods, and the factors affecting consumer acceptance of reduced sodium foods and possible solutions for improved acceptance by consumers for lower sodium content food products. So what is salt or what is sodium? So salt, the discovery of salt basically took place way back in civilization, and it resulted in longer shelf life and transport of food over longer distances. Salt, as we know it, is sodium chloride, which is an ionic compound with the formula NaCl, and it contains 40% of sodium and 60% chloride. Sea salt is mainly our freshly mined salt, and it contains minor, which we call trace amounts of sodium, and it is generally good for plant health and animal health. Mined salt, on the other hand, is refined salt, which we call table salt, and to this table salt, we normally have iodine added, or what we call fortification. So salt versus sodium. Is there really a difference between salt and sodium? And yes, there is a difference. Salt is basically the chemical compound that is made up of sodium and chloride. The chloride is the element of the salt which gives food its salty taste, so to speak. Sodium, on the other hand, is a mineral that is naturally present in nearly all foods, as Professor Ferguson mentioned earlier. But excess sodium can be detrimental to health. Salt or other sodium-based compounds such as MSG and preservatives such as our sodium acetate or sodium bicarbonate and so on, all contain sodium. And if you look carefully on your label, food label ingredients listing, I'm sure we have all seen these substances listed on our food labels. Sodium content is what is normally reported in the nutrition facts panel on our food labels. And here we see a chemical diagram of salt, which is, as I mentioned before, basically sodium and chloride. So 40% sodium and 60% chloride. What are the functions of salt in our food products? Salt or sodium have varying functions in food products. We look at things like preservation. We look at things as in improving texture, imparting flavor, inhibiting clouding in food products, and also functional purposes. So as a preservative, salt is used to reduce spoilage in products such as breads, margarine, spreads. It is used to improve the metabolic activity of cultures in like our cheese and yogurts, food products like those. It affects product texture of bread or breakfast cereals and savory snacks. And it does that because it does what we call improving the gelatinization of protein. So that is the chemical process by which it affects or improves the texture of final products. It imparts flavors across many products because salt can decrease or affect sweet taste or bitter taste in food products. And for functional uses, it can be used as a binding agent to enhance color, and also in what we call our functional drinks, like our energy drinks, which contain sodium, which are important in potassium and sodium metabolism for muscle function, and also to help athletes to recover better because it improves hydration after strenuous exercise. So now let us look at the levels of sodium that is in our packaged food. Because as mentioned earlier, high sodium levels or consuming too much sodium can be detrimental. In looking at sodium in packaged food, first I went to look at the levels for the Caribbean. And if we look on our slide here, we can see that the sodium level varies across a wide variety of products, right? Sodium is in our soups, in our processed meats, in our breads, in our mayonnaise. We look at things such as our cookies, our biscuits, or cakes, and we see that sodium is also present in those products. And our condiments, pasta, snack foods also contains sodium. So some products have wider variation, while some products have exceedingly high levels of sodium per serving, as is shown here. Now, looking at sodium levels in packaged or pre-packaged foods in Jamaica, I looked at a study conducted by Soares Winter & Company in 2019, and these are the results presented here. And if we look, we see that overall, there was a high sodium content in 17% of our beverages and overall 57% of our foods. Foods such as legumes contain 78% excess sodium. Breads and baked products contained approximately 52% excess sodium. Or dairy drinks even contain 42% excess sodium, and our spices containing 80%. And when we look at categories such as meats and eggs and fish and seafood, those contain a whopping 92 and 97% excess sodium, respectively. So we are seeing here in Jamaica, because these data were gathered from a large nutrient profiling system research, and we see that a lot of our packaged food and our pre-processed foods contain high sodium content, and this is concerning. So let us now look at how do we calculate sodium in our food products. So you buy a food product, you look on the back of it and you see 6 grams of sodium or 6 milligrams of sodium. Do we know exactly what that means? So as the WHO tells us, foods high in sodium contains more than 1.5 to 2 grams of salt per 100 gram, while low sodium foods should contain less than 0.3 grams of salt. Now to convert sodium to salt, there are 2 steps in the process. First, we have to multiply the amount of sodium present on our food label by the factor 2.5, and then we have to adjust salt for the weight of the serving size of the product if it is different rather than 100 grams. So let's look at an example very quickly. So say, for example, we buy product A, and product A contains 0.65 grams of sodium per 100 gram. And the serving size for product A is, say, 30 grams. How do we calculate the salt content of product A? So first, as aforementioned, we multiply the sodium amount by 2.5. So this product contains 0.65 grams of sodium. Therefore, multiplying that by 2.5, we get 1.6. And that is the amount of salt per 100 gram of the product. Now to adjust for the salt weight based on the serving size, we have to multiply by the product, by the serving size, which was stated as 30 grams, and divide by 100 because it is per 100 grams. So therefore, product A would end up containing 0.65 grams of salt per 30 gram serving, because 30 grams is a serving size. I hope everybody is following. If you have questions about this calculation, you can place it in the questions and answer section. So as stated when we began, we want to look at the factors that affect consumer acceptance of food products, because this entire webinar is about reformulating, moving to healthier populations. So we have to look at how it is that consumers will accept products of a lower sodium content. So generally, there are three critical factors that determine how consumers perceive or accept food products. So first, we have our consumer characteristics. Now, our consumer characteristics include knowledge, innovativeness, attitudes and beliefs, and the perceptions of a particular food product. Now, when we talk about knowledge, we talk about how aware the consumer is of the food product that they are buying to consume. Innovativeness, we talk about how willing consumers will be to try a new product. Attitudes and beliefs and perceptions all come from what consumers think or pre-think about the food product. For example, an ad is placed advertising a particular food product. When a consumer buys that food product, they have the ad in the back of their heads, and they look to see how it is that the actual product that they are consuming matches up with the ad. Is it of the same color? Does the product taste exactly how they thought it would have tasted? Things like that. Then we look at sensory characteristics. And sensory characteristics are our taste, the texture of the product, the aroma, the smell, the appearance, and all these have distinct influential factors on how consumer affects food, or consumer accept foods. Then we look at what we call our feel-good factor. How does this food make a consumer feel when they consume it? We normally go out and we buy a chocolate and we eat it because it lets us feel good. So those three factors affect how it is that consumer accept food products. And as we know, sodium contributes to all these factors and therefore must be considered when we are reformulating our products to reduce salt, because we want more healthy products. And as Trevor mentioned earlier, increased levels of salt affect can lead to obesity, can lead to stroke, hypertension, all those factors. So we have to, in reformulating to benefit health, we have to balance the act. As Dr. Soares-Winter mentioned, we have to balance the preservation of the food versus the health issue. It's all a balancing act. And therefore, that is why it is important to consider these factors before we go into research and development. Then we want to look at now how it is that when sodium is reduced in our food, what are the possible outcomes for acceptability with consumers? So I found out in doing research that, there are many possible outcomes. First, consumer acceptance can be maintained even after there is a significant reduction in salt contents. And research has shown us that consumers still accept food products even when there was a quarter decrease or a 25% decrease in the sodium content of food. The responses, however, differed by food category. So, for example, consumers may accept bread, but they may notice that there's a different sodium level in cheeses or milk products. Changing food preferences to lower sodium content can also affect consumer acceptability, in that they may move to eating less than eating less of that particular food product, or they may look to other additional ingredients such as adding discretionary sugar. So the results can be positive or negative, so to speak. So how is it possible for us to have a reduced sodium content in our food, but also to maintain and improve acceptance? So first, we can have gradual reduction over time. So in farm manufacturers, especially in reducing the sodium content of your food, it is not wise to just make a drastic reduction on the first go. So it is better to work with gradual reduction over time. And this is where we can contact persons at the SRC or the BSJ. We can talk to persons at CARE to provide us and to help us when we are reformulating our products. We can use sodium-free alternatives such as other mineral salts. Potassium substitutes are an excellent way of reducing the sodium and still maintaining acceptability by consumers. And what we can also do, and this particular aspect is very important, is to market the health benefits of reduced sodium in our foods. Tell our consumers that this is what the benefits of consuming foods with low sodium are, and they will be more prone to or more lenient to accepting the food with a low sodium content. We also can say to the consumer, place instructions on the packaging. For example, there is brine washing of brine or water washing to remove excess brine for our foods that are preserved in brine. Or for example, our peanuts that may have extra salted nuts, we can say dust before consuming or wash product in water before consuming or preparing. So as manufacturers, these are the information that you can disseminate via labeling or in your adverts to your consumer. So in summarizing, just to recap our main points from my presentation, salt or sodium has various uses in food, enhancing flavor, texture, for preservation, as a binder, many benefits. So sodium is very, very important. Sodium or salt is very, very important in our food products. Reformulation with reduced salt is more cost effective and impactful on reducing population health risk. And we want to move towards a healthier population. So this is important. Reformulation can result in readjustment to lower salt preferences by the consumers. And this is what we want. So we gradually reduce the salt content of our products. Lastly, solutions for improved acceptance of reduced sodium include the gradual reduction over time, the use of sodium-free alternatives, and marketing of the health benefits associated with lower sodium content foods to our consumers. So this is where I end my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful, Ms. Hall. Thank you very much. You know, when we look at sodium, as I said before, that it really appears to be just a simple ingredient, but it really has multiple functions in food rather than just taste. We wanted to go into some question and answers in that session, so I hope you'll stay around to answer. So, Ms. Hall.
I will.
Right. So if you look in the Q&A section, Ms. Morrison, will you take these questions?
Yeah, actually, there was a question in the main chat, so I'm going to start with that one and then go into the Q&A ones because that came first. And so the question was from Vanda Singh, and the question was, given that different product categories contain different salt levels, should targets be established according to these product categories based on consumption quantity and frequency? This would be instead of establishing one target across the board for all product categories.
Yes, that is a very good question. But at the end of the day, no matter the category of product that we consume, at the end of the day, no matter the category of product that we consume, it is still the sodium content that we are going to get, and it is the sodium content that is detrimental to our health. So therefore, that is why the World Health Organization has set one standard, because above this, the research has been done, and above this level, the sodium content will affect our health.
All right, and then the next question is from Natalie McNeil Beecher, and the question is, please redo calculations, reconcentration of salt.
Okay, let me just bring up that slide for Natalie. Okay, so when we buy, for example, a peanut, right? What is presented on the nutritional facts label is the sodium content. They do not say to us that this is the amount of salt that is contained in the food. So therefore, we have to do the calculation to see, based on the serving size of the product, how much sodium or salt we are really consuming. Understood so far? So first of all, this is the science of it. First of all, we want to convert the amount of sodium that they place on the food packaging label. We want to convert that. We want to multiply that by a factor of 2.5. And this will give us how many grams of salt or the product actually contains per 100 grams. So it's a percentage. Per 100, it is a percentage, right? After we calculate the amount of salt per 100 gram of the product, we have to adjust for the serving size, because the serving size is given on the label. Estimated serving size or recommended serving size is, say, for example, 30 grams, or serving size is 50 grams, what have you. So let's look at the product, the example that we looked at. Product A. We buy a product A, and we see that it contains 0.65 grams of sodium, right? We are all used to this information on our nutritional panels label, right? This amount of sodium represents, this amount represents the amount of sodium per 100 gram, right? And that is what they use to calculate the percentage that you normally see accompanying the mass of sodium on your nutritional facts label. Okay, then now we need to calculate how much sodium or salt this contains based on the serving, right? Because normally a serving is not always 100 gram. 100 gram is the whole. A serving is not normally 100 gram. So in order to convert now the amount of sodium per 100 gram to accommodate for the serving size, or the recommended serving size on the label, we have to multiply rather by the serving size. So therefore, if we multiply the 0.65, which is the mass of the sodium, by 2.5, then we get how much salt it has per 100 gram, right? And that gives us 1.6. 0.65 times 2.5, 1.6. Then because the product gram has a serving of 30 grams, right? That is the recommendation that they would have placed on the product. We have to multiply the amount of salt per 100 gram by the serving size. So we want to adjust the salt for the weight or the mass of the serving size. And then now we divide by 100, because the 100 is the whole, and then we get the amount of salt or sodium present in the food product per the serving size, which was 30 grams. I hope that it is clearer now.
Thank you. And just to say that we'll make the slides available, which was related to the next comment. The next person, Charmaine Plummer, was asking if she could get a copy of the presentation to really be able to digest. So we will make that available to all attendees so that you can go over it and you can have that as a resource. And then the next question comes in from an anonymous attendee, but the question is, how do we manage consumer taste expectations for salt-reduced foods? There are other sensory studies which have shown that consumers normally expect low sodium foods to not have good/acceptable flavor. Higher sodium foods usually sell at a higher rate than the reduced sodium alternative.
So in order to manage this, based on the science, and I mentioned it in my presentation, we can move to other minerals. So for example, potassium is a good mineral, and studies have shown that when we replace sodium with potassium, the acceptance is almost as close as to the actual sodium. So we move to other mineral salts that are less detrimental to our health. That is the first thing. So that is the first step in managing how consumers would accept low or perceive lower sodium foods. So therefore they won't end up saying, oh, this is bland or this is trashy tasting food. So the perfect way to do that is to move to alternative minerals, such as our potassium.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Hall. Unfortunately, we have to move on, but I am going to ask you to actually look in the Q&A. There are a few other questions that I'd really appreciate if you could look at and provide our attendees with a response.
I will.
Now. But thank you very much. That was very informative and yes, very, very interesting in how sodium really impacts the perception. So we will move on next, just to get everybody moving a bit with a segment from the Ministry of Health. This will be done by Miss, I think, Juliet, I hope I'm pronouncing your name, Miss Juliet Pomels, who is a physical activity specialist for the Northeast region in the Ministry of Health and Wellness. Over to you.
March on the spot. March. Everybody get up their cheers. Out. Open. Side. Open. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At the front. Open the chest. Open. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. After 3, you're going to go across it. Up. Get your legs out and reach over. Reach. These are dynamic stretches. Let's go. Up. Good. On the spot. Right here. Up. We're gonna go heel on the floor right here. Just roll the shoulders. Roll it. And bend. Heel. Right here. Curl those arms up. We're moving. Getting those blood pumped up. Good circulation for your body. Let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go. Right here. Marching on the spot. Hey. Right here. Hands up right here. We're gonna go to the side. Push. Push. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Up. Right here. These are moderate jumping jacks right here. Just taking it out. Right here. Push up. Roll. Lift those knees up. Lift. Take a deep breath in and exhale. We're gonna step right here. We're gonna do a little wheel bounce right here. Step. We're gonna go up. Hey, hey, up here, up, 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 up. Reach, 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 reach. Feeling good? 3, 2, 1. Right across, right here. Cross, 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 cross. After 3, we're gonna put the heel in front. Right here. 3, 2, 1, and pull, pull, pull. Drop the shoulders and roll them. Come on, right here, right here. And the music, we're just gonna march it, march it, march it, march it, march it, march it, march it. Right here. Take some deep breath in and exhale. In, exhale. In, exhale. In, exhale. One big one in, exhale. In, exhale. Let's push to the side right here. Push right here. In, exhale, push. In, exhale. Roll it around to the next side. Push in, exhale. In, exhale. Right back in front here. Let's take a deep breath in and exhale. I want to leave with you 3 tips to improve your habits. All right, number 1, you need to take an inventory. What are you eating? When are you eating? How are you eating? The portions that you're eating, that's your inventory. Am I taking enough water in? What is my water intake? Number 2 is that we need to evaluate our lives. How am I, what is important? Am I going to bed too late? So you're going to know, look at now saying, let me go to bed 30 minutes earlier, because sleep do affect your lifestyle. All right? So am I going to, you can now look at how important this is for you with your healthy lifestyle. And the final one is you're going to be making small goals. We have a big goal, but let us make small goals. Weekly goals, daily goals. Today I'm going to drink water throughout the day. Alright? I'm going to stand every 5 minutes each hour. So at the end of each hour, I'm going to stand for 2 minutes or 5 minutes of the hour and start moving so that we're not sitting too long at our desk. So remember, people, make small goals, evaluate yourself, all right? And remember to love yourself, love your body. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Juliet. I know you just tested me, and even though I'm a nutritionist, it was a good reminder that I too need to make sure that I get my exercise in. And you've given us some really, really great tips. And it's not just about diet, but definitely physical activity is half of the equation to keeping us fit and healthy. So thank you very, very much. I'm glad that you were able to come on so we could see you in person. And yes, just to explain to our participants that, please visit the Ministry of Health and Wellness website. There are lots of very useful information. We encourage you when you're having your meetings, since we're all looking at Zoom now, you can actually incorporate these types of activities in your meetings. And there is lots of information, very helpful information on how you can get your exercise program going. Thank you again, Juliet, and great to see you here. All right, so now that we're all very energized, we're ready to hear from our next speaker. And reminding you again, please look at the question and answer section so that we can move ahead. So our next speaker is really going to speak on some of the practical recommendations for reducing or replacing salt or sodium. You know, so looking at those foods that we know are classically very high in sodium, and, you know, we probably eat them because they're so salty. So chips, bread, soups, sauces, processed meats, and other products. And, you know, I'm very aware that we get accustomed to salt. Salt is just one of those nutrients that the more you have of it is the more you actually want it. All right. So just to give some information on who Miss Gilpin is, Miss Avalon Gilpin, she's a research scientist at the Scientific Research Council. She graduated from the University of the West Indies, Mona, with first-class honors in food chemistry and a minor in environmental chemistry. Ms. Gilpin pursued a Master of Science in Food and Agro-Processing Technology, also at the UWI. In her professional capacity, Ms. Gilpin was employed as a Research and Development Officer at Grace Kennedy for 5 years, where she was integrally involved in the development of different categories of food products. In September of 2019, she assumed the position of research scientist at the Scientific Research Council, where she's currently a member of the food unit of the Product Development and Research Division. So, Ms. Gilpin, I'm going to hand over to you now so you can help to give us some recommendations on how we can reduce salt in foods.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Avalon Gilpin. I am a research scientist at the Scientific Research Council, and I will be talking today about a practical approach to salt reduction and replacement. So what are some of the functions of salt in food? Salt acts as a flavor enhancer, preservative, texture enhancer, color enhancer, and also as a nutrient source. So what are some of the challenges with salt reformulation? One, salt is very effective at low concentrations. It is also cheaper than some other substitutes that you might apply, and it doesn't impart bitter, metallic, or flavors that some of the salt substitutes might have. And you don't require the use of flavor masking agents with it as you would with other salt substitutes. So how do we reduce salt? With all the functions that salt performs in foods, how can we reduce it safely and keep our consumers satisfied? One method you can apply is salt reduction, and that is gradually changing the quantity of salt in products and thus reducing consumers' salt flavor threshold over time. And this can be applied to all of our products, especially in the chips and the snacks products, where you can easily just gradually reduce the salt content over time. So this is an example of bread formulation where we are gradually reducing the salt content from the original amount of 1.2%. And first, a manufacturer might reduce it by 5% and allow consumers' palates to adjust to the reduction. And then once their flavor threshold changes, then you can apply another reduction, such as a 10%, and then another reduction. But what do we do when your consumers begin to notice this reduction and no longer find it acceptable? Because for different products, salt reduction may be more readily perceived than for others. And this can be applied to many of our savory products. So this is an example of soup formulation. And this can also be applied for your sauces as well. So for this soup, we have applied a 15% reduction in the salt content. However, we have also done an increase of the savory raw materials, such as the onion powder, the garlic powder, and the chicken flavor. And in this way, although we reduce the sodium or the salt, we've increased other flavors that will act as flavor enhancers in the product and make the product more acceptable. But what do you do when you want to reduce the sodium, but not necessarily the saltiness? This is where we apply technologies to replace salt flavoring. And some examples are shown in this slide, where you see potassium chloride, calcium, and magnesium chloride. These are salts as well and act as substitute for sodium chloride. Now, potassium chloride is the most widely used substitute and can replace up to 50% in some applications. It is very good at promoting protein, water, and fat binding in meat processing. And however, one issue with it is that as you increase the concentration of potassium chloride, you will start to impart bitter metallic aftertaste rather than the salty flavor that consumers like. So what do you do when this happens? This is where you start to add flavor enhancers. So what flavor enhancers do is that they interact with protein receptors on the tongue and actually improve our perception of salty flavor or savory flavors. And examples of these flavor enhancers include monosodium glutamate, which has less available sodium than the sodium chloride, hydrolyzed vegetable proteins and yeast extracts, which contain amino acid byproducts. And these amino acid byproducts act as both flavor enhancers and masking agents for the bitter flavor compounds that might be imparted by the potassium chloride or other salt substitutes such as the calcium and magnesium chloride. So another technology that is being marketed is the use of sea salt in place of table salt. And one of the reasons is that a teaspoon of sea salt contains less sodium content than a teaspoon of table salt. And this is because of the granular structure of sea salt. So a teaspoon of sea salt is about 4.1 grams, while a teaspoon of table salt is about 6.1 grams. So what it means is that it's not necessarily that you have less quantity in terms of mass, but the sea salt, because of the structure, takes up a less amount, takes up the same teaspoon than for the table salt. So it can be applied, but it is not necessarily the most effective use of salt replacement. So I wanted to look at salt reduction in meat, because in meat processing, sodium chloride acts as a flavor enhancer. It enhances the tenderness of the meat and the juiciness of the meat. However, it is very important in the role of food safety and the shelf life of your meat products. And therefore, when you're reducing the sodium content in meat, you must know that you can only reduce the salt to a certain level and no more. And for higher reductions, you will require the use of these salt alternatives, the use of phosphates, which promote the protein binding with the fat and water. It improves the texture of the meat, the use of masking agents to assist with the bitter notes that may be imparted by the salt alternatives, and also the use of flavor enhancers, which is going to improve the savory umami flavor profiles that you might want. So in this example for a sausage recipe, we've applied a 15% reduction at first. Now, once we've applied the 15% reduction of the sodium chloride, we've addressed this 15% reduction by adding the potassium chloride with the equivalent amount that was taken from the salt. Now, once we've moved on to a 30% reduction and we've increased the potassium chloride to the amount that was removed from the sodium chloride, we see that we'll now have to address this by adding additional raw materials such as the yeast extract. And this is because as you go up in the potassium chloride that you've added, you're going to impart other flavor notes, and this needs to be addressed by the addition of additional materials that is going to act to kind of reduce the impact that these material is going to have on the flavor of the product. So you're in the middle of your reformulations, or you are completing your reformulations. What do you do next, or what do you do during all your reformulation exercise? You need to test these formulation changes. It is very important to conduct objective tests where you're testing the profile of your products, whether it's the nutritional profile, the microbiological profile, which is most important for your meat products that salt has such an important impact on. And you must test the profile of all of the chemical and the physical attributes of your product to see whether or not the changes you have applied have affected other attributes other than the flavor. because you might need to add other materials that is going to act to improve the moisture content, if that is, of the product, and also the yield. So you can conduct objective tests in all these forms and other objective tests to see whether the formulation changes have had other impacts on your products. Now, once you've completed this, then you need to do subjective testing. This is where you bring in taste testers or panelists to examine the new changes and see whether or not they accept it. Is this change acceptable? Do they prefer the original? Do they prefer the other? Is one particular attribute, such as the flavor, just right? Is the texture just right? Or are there other changes that you can apply? And all of these sensory tests will act to target areas where a manufacturer might need to target and improve certain attributes about the product. Okay. So now we've reached the end, right? And I've spoken to you all about all of the changes that you can possibly apply to your formulations to reduce the salt content. And I know that it might be challenging for some manufacturers to undertake, especially for our small and medium businesses that might not have a research and development officer on staff. However, it is very important. It takes some amount of trial and error, but it is very important and worthwhile to do to remain competitive in the way how food is being manufactured now and in the future. I thank you all for your time and attention, and I hope you have learned from this exercise. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Gilpin. That was extremely interesting. We do have some question and answers that I'd love for you if you could look at it and just see if there's anything there. But for now, before we go into the formal Q&A, I wanted to quickly switch over to our next speaker, which will supplement some of the information that Ms. Gilpin just provided. So I'm going to ask you to stick around. And so we will be introducing our next speaker, Ms. Philippa O'Connor, who is a Senior Standards Officer at the Bureau of Standards, Jamaica. I know Ms. O'Connor is very versed in a lot of the labeling issues that we are facing now. So just to give an idea of who Ms. O'Connor is, she's a Senior Standards Officer at the Bureau of Standards, Jamaica, a very meticulous and detailed, organized quality professional with over 8 years of experience in standards development, conformity assessment, and technical regulations. Ms. O'Connor possesses a BSc degree in dietetics and nutrition and manages the national discussions regarding nutrition and front of package labeling, or what you may see as FOPL. So Ms. O'Connor is here today to tell us some of the opportunities for nutrition claims and labeling and give us an idea of what currently exists in Jamaica and the Caribbean. And there is nobody who is more versed and experienced in this topic. So Philippa, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winter. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Let me adjust my volume for a second. All right, so as mentioned earlier, I'll be doing a presentation this morning regarding the existing regulations in Jamaica pertaining to nutrition labeling, claims, and what exists in Jamaica and the Caribbean. So the content of my presentation, right. The content for my presentation, I'll be taking a look at the definitions for nutrition claims and the nutrition labeling. I'll also be taking a look at the existing regulations for nutrition labeling and claims in Jamaica and by extension the Caribbean, the benefits and implications for the food industry, the benefits and implications for the consumer, and the benefits and implications for the government of Jamaica. Now, I have here a very graphic display of some existing language regarding claims. You have fiber-rich, 100% trans fat free, light, baked, not fried, no MSG, no preservatives, high in protein, and no added calories. But having established all of that, we want to take a look at what exactly are nutrition claims. Now, nutrition claims, they are defined as any representation which states, suggests, or implies that a food has particular nutritional properties, including but not limited to the energy value and to the content of protein, fat, and carbohydrates, as well as the content of vitamins and minerals. Nutritional labeling is defined as a listing of the level of nutrients as displayed on the food label, and it is meant to provide factual information about the nutritional content of the product. What are the different types of claims? So having defined what a nutrition claim is and the definition for nutritional labeling, we want to take a little more closer look at the different types of claims that exist. And I have here nutrient content claim, comparative claim, and nutrient function claim. So what is a nutrient content claim? It describes the level of a nutrient contained in a food. So for example, as I have displayed here, it's high in fiber. So it's a source of calcium, or it's low in fat. So this is describing the level of fiber contained in this particular product here. And in comparison to a particular criteria or threshold, the fiber content is perceived to be high. So that would be a nutrient content claim, or example of a nutrient content claim. The comparative claim, it compares the nutrient levels and or energy value of two or more foods. So for examples, reduced, less than, fewer, increased, or more than. And I have here an example of a comparative claim with this Heinz tomato ketchup. So it has here labeled reduced sugar. The function claim. Now, the nutrient function claim describes the physiological role of the nutrient in growth, development, and normal functions of the body. So for example, this box here describing whole milk, and it's describing it as being supportive of brain health. So the function claim here is stating that omega-3 is important in brain health. It supports brain health, and that would be an example of a function claim. Now, we want to take a look at what exists in terms of the regulations in Jamaica and Caribbean. What exists that will regulate the use of nutritional labeling and nutrition claims. Now, in terms of existing regulations for nutritional labeling and claims, there's the JSCRS 5 2010, and that's the Jamaican standard specification for the labeling of prepackaged foods. And there's a Food and Nutrition Food Security Policy 2013. I'm going to be taking a more detailed look at each particular document. So the JSCRS 5 2010, for those of us who are not familiar with standardization and standards development, the nomenclature CRS denotes that it's a CARICOM regional standard, and JS means it's a Jamaican standard. So really, we've adopted a CARICOM standard and make it a Jamaican. It makes references to Annex A, which is a normative reference, meaning that the requirements contained therein is compulsory. Annex A makes provision for the use of claims, and as prescribed by the JSCRS 5, nutritional labeling is optional and the standard is mandatory. So I'm going to get a little bit more granular with all of what I just said a while ago. So in the CRS 5 standard, nutritional claim, where there's a claim, then you have to put on a nutritional label. But however, in our current jurisdiction and also in CARICOM, nutritional labeling is voluntary at the moment. And I will speak a little bit more about the pending regulation regarding that. So what I'm saying is that manufacturers locally and in CARICOM, they're not mandated by the different laws to make a nutritional facts panel label mandatory. So they don't have to put it on. However, if they choose to export, the relevant market would require a nutritional facts panel. For example, in the US and Canada, nutritional labeling is mandatory. So if a Jamaican manufacturer wants to export to these territories, then they have to put it on. However, for sale in the domestic market, nutritional labeling at the moment is voluntary. Annex A in CRS 5, it provides basic guidelines as to how the claims are supposed to be used and under what conditions. The Food and Nutrition Food Security Policy of 2013, it was developed by the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, and it provides the strategies, actions, and framework within which critical issues of food and nutrition security will be addressed. Now, I made reference earlier to the fact that there's a pending regulation for nutritional labeling, and this is one of those regulations that are currently under development. So what is this pending nutritional labeling standard? It references the Codex guideline, that's the CAC GL 23/1997, the Codex guideline for the use of nutrition claims. And at the moment, the standard is currently under development. The intention of the pending nutritional labeling standard is for it to be made mandatory in every CARICOM member state, and we are hoping to have it promulgated by December 2022. Now, there's a thrust nationally and regionally for member states in CARICOM to implement some form of a program that would assist the governments within the different territories and the region on a whole to reduce the incidences of NCDs. And the CRS 5 standard was posited as one of those mechanisms, as well as nutritional labeling standard. There's ongoing discussion now within Jamaica and also in CARICOM with the revision of the CRS 5 standard to include front of package labeling. And the nutritional labeling standard is another tool that is, the intention is for it to be used within the member states to form a part of this program in terms of getting consumers to read their labels and change their eating patterns. And so the intention in the next 2 to 3 years is to make nutritional labeling mandatory by the implementation of this standard. The pending standard will be applicable to nutritional labeling of all prepackaged foods, and it will not address food weighed or measured in or counted into the package in the presence of the purchaser, provided that nutrition information is provided at the point of sale. It also will not address food intended for export only, as I made mention earlier, which complies with the requirements of standards or laws on labeling of the country to which they are being exported. And it will not address front of package labeling because, as mentioned earlier, the FOPL is being discussed for inclusion in the CRS 5. The related acts that will support nutrition labeling and the use of claims are the Standards Act 1969, the Processed Food Act 1959, and the Food and Drug Act of 1975. So having established what claims are, how they are used, what is nutritional labeling, how it is used, and the different regulations that exist that will support the use of claims and labeling, having established all of that, we want to take a little look at how will these benefit the industry, the consumer, and the government. For the food industry, definitely, production of more nutritious products, enhanced product profile, provides effective communications tool, increase international trade opportunities. And I'm going to go from the bottom up. In terms of trade, it has to do with market access requirements. So it will enable manufacturers to trade on a wider scope in terms of if they want to go to the US or Canada, if they already have on a fax panel, well, it would have been easier for them to get their products into that market. It provides effective communications tool because consumers will not be able to find that form of information regarding the contents of their food. And it does encourage product reformulation, and it helps by enhances the product profile. For the consumer, it builds confidence and it enables educated food choices. So persons are now empowered to make more informed choices based on the availability of information, as well as provision of information will build a confidence. So if, for example, if I go in the supermarket and I see a product with nutritional labeling versus one that does not, I am more inclined to purchase the one that has on the facts panel, where I can obtain information as to what I'll be consuming. For the government, it supports the government's nutrition education activities, and by encouraging consumers to practice nutrition principles when selecting foods and planning for meals. It provides a framework for public health policies, and it supports food security. The opportunities for Jamaica, and by extension the Caribbean, is the implementation of nutrition labeling on a mandatory basis for both domestic and imported food products, collaboration between pertinent ministries of government for the execution of nutrition education programs, provision of incentives to encourage product reformulation, which my colleagues made mention or gave a very more in-depth presentation on that earlier, and ultimately better health, less pressure on the medical infrastructure. And I have my reference here, which is the Codex Guideline for the Use of Nutrition Claims. And that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. As always, Ms. Akana, very informative, lots of information, and I'm sure that we'll explain to participants that, you know, if you don't really understand a lot here, you know, the Bureau of Standards Jamaica and the Scientific Research Council are there to provide any additional information. We're a little over time, but I'm glad that we still have quite a number of persons online. So we will just move very quickly if anyone has any additional questions. Both Ms. O'Connor and Ms. Gilpin, we actually have some questions. If you could just look at the Q&A to see if there are any questions that you may answer. I know there is one maybe for Ms. O'Connor about...
So, two questions, and very quickly. So one for Mrs. O'Connor, which is, why are manufacturers not mandated to put nutritional labeling for the domestic market? That comes from Stephanie Stewart. And then there was a request for Javita Ludwig to rephrase the question on how much grams of salt is in a teaspoon of our salt table.
Okay, I'll respond to the question regarding the nutrition labeling and why it's not required. At the moment, as I made mention, our current regulations and the regulatory framework, it does not mandate it that manufacturers within the domestic market, Jamaica, that they have to put on a facts panel. What is required is for them to list the ingredients that is in the food, and this is compliant with the different labeling regulations that exist now. However, if a manufacturer wishes to export, then whatever that market requires, they have to comply. I also want to note that that is changing regarding the non-existence of a nutritional labeling or the lack of it being enforced. That will be changing in the next 2 to 3 years. So currently the rationale for the why is because of our regulations. We don't have, none of our regulations or standards for labeling prescribes that nutritional labeling must be on the panel. And so in the absence of that, there's nothing for it to be enforced, but that will be changed in the short order.
I see another one from Devin Stewart. Well, it's somewhat of a comment and a question that these acts seem pretty old. And should they be amended to fully reflect changes in research, or do they cover what is critical?
Okay, I can respond to, but I can speak for the Processed Food Act and the Standards Act because they're within the remit of the Bureau of Standards Jamaica. Those two acts are currently under revision. We do acknowledge that they are pretty much still dated, and they're currently being reviewed for amendment to be updated to reflect current practices and research.
Okay. Well, again, just telling our participants, please feel free to continue with adding any questions or reach out to the Heart Foundation, as well as any of our panelists and the organizations they represent to ask any questions directly. I know we've had a very interesting morning. I've actually learned quite a few things on sodium that I didn't know. And, you know, we had a very good lineup. So we first heard from Dr. Ferguson, who spoke to more why we should reduce salt and some of the health aspects. Then by Ms. Prudence Hall, who, you know, went into some of the functions of salt, especially in manufacturing, and why consumers may or may not accept. We spoke on more recently here with Ms. Gilpin and Ms. O'Connor, who looked at, you know, they looked at the practical recommendations on how we can make adjustments, and also some of the labeling requirements as it relates to sodium. And also the Ministry of Health with Ms. Juliette Pomels, who got some of us moving. And again, we encourage you to continue moving. And again, Ms. Morrison, thank you very much for assisting with the Q&A. And before we go, I just want to remind you that next week we have an equally exciting presentation. We'll be focusing on trans fats. And we have a number of speakers then next week. And it will be the same time at 10 o'clock. So that's next week, Wednesday, the 7th of July at 10 a.m. We ask for you to register if you haven't done so. And we'll supply an agenda when you get registered. So we know we have a very interesting lineup of very experienced speakers then. But again, on behalf of the Heart Foundation, the Global Health Advocacy Project, my institute, CARE, the CARFA, the National Food Industry Task Force, Scientific Research Council, University of Technology of Jamaica, and our Ministry of Health and Wellness, thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope that you've learned something, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Hello! Today we're going to be making breakfast and preparing a lunchbox for school. Let's start with some sugar and salt. And wash it down with a nice big glass of more sugar. And now for the lunchbox. Let's put in saturated fat, more salt, and sugar. Foods high in salt, fats, and sugar increase the risk of hypertension, obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. Now more than ever, we have the right to know what's in our food. Give us warning labels on the front of our food packages.